The auction house smelled like motor oil and wet concrete, the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat and doesn't leave. Tessa Marlowe noticed it the moment she pushed through the side door. The one the volunteer had told her to use, the one that didn't require registration or a bidder's paddle. She was 23 years old, 5'4", wearing her father's old canvas jacket, 2 sizes too large for her shoulders, and she had $2,800 in a manila envelope tucked inside her left pocket. Nobody looked at her when she walked in. Then somebody did. Then everybody did. The building was a decommissioned agricultural warehouse on the outskirts of Truro, Nova Scotia, the kind of place that hosted farm equipment sales in the spring, and nothing at all in the winter. Tonight it had been rented out by the Canadian Armed Forces Transition and Disposal Office, which was a very long name for a very simple operation. They were selling off assets that no longer had a use: vehicles, equipment, and dogs. Folding chairs had been set up in uneven rows, facing a raised platform at the far end. The crowd was mostly men, contractors, security firms, a few municipal police representatives with lanyards around their necks. One man near the front held a tablet and spoke quietly into a Bluetooth earpiece. Another wore a jacket with a private military company logo Tessa didn't recognize. Nobody here was looking for a companion. Nobody here was looking for anything with a heartbeat. They were looking for capability, for return on investment. She found a spot against the back wall and stayed there. Up front, a man in a grey suit was finishing a speech about liability waivers. The folding table beside the platform held numbered placards and a portable speaker playing hold music that nobody had thought to turn off. A single fluorescent tube above the platform flickered every 40 seconds, almost rhythmically, almost like it was breathing. Tessa counted the dogs in the staging area through the chain-link gate on the left side. 7. She only needed one. His name was Vex. She knew his file the way other people know the plot of a movie they've watched too many times. Belgian Malinois, male, 7 years old, deployed 3 times with the Joint Task Force 2 unit her father had served with. Handler, Master Corporal Eldon Marlowe, retired from active service 14 months ago, following an IED incident in which the handler had not survived and the dog had technically, but nobody in any official document wanted to use that word. Survived, like it implied something good had happened. The file said Vex had been assessed as operationally non-transferable due to single handler bonding and demonstrated aggression toward unfamiliar personnel. It said he had bitten 2 kennel staff in the 18 months since her father's death. It said he had stopped eating reliably. It said a veterinary behaviorist had recommended euthanasia twice and been overruled twice, because somewhere in a chain of command that nobody seemed to want to follow all the way up, someone kept writing hold on the form. Tessa thought it was her father's commanding officer, Major Sylvie Drummond, who had done that. She'd never been able to confirm it. Major Drummond had retired herself 6 months ago and wasn't returning calls. What Tessa knew was this: in 4 days the hold expired and Vex was lot number 9. The auction moved faster than she expected. Lots 1 through 4 were vehicles: a pair of armored personnel carrier components, a decommissioned snowmobile, a satellite uplink trailer. These went quickly to the tablet man near the front, who didn't bother raising a paddle, just typed. Lot 5 was a German shepherd named Rook. Tessa watched him come through the gate on a single lead, calm, ears forward, tail low and still. He sold in under 2 minutes to a representative from a private security company in Calgary. Rook walked out without looking back. Lot 6. Lot 7, a Belgian Malinois named Crest, who had a tremor in his left rear leg and sold for $600 to a man Tessa couldn't see from where she stood. Lot 8 was a Labrador retriever trained in explosives detection. A woman in a red lanyard bought him on behalf of the Edmonton Airport Authority. He wagged his tail the entire time he was on the platform. Then the auctioneer paused. It wasn't a dramatic pause. He was just reading something on the clipboard that the handler had passed him, and his face did a thing, a tightening around the jaw, a fraction of a second that a less attentive person would have missed entirely. "Lot 9, he said. 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, male. Working designation VEX. Former JTF2 asset, MWD certified in patrol, tracking and apprehension." He stopped, cleared his throat. "We'll please maintain your positions." The chain-link gate on the left opened and 2 handlers came through with catch poles. Tessa had expected the catch poles. She had not expected to feel her entire chest collapse when she saw them. Vex came out fighting, not in the way a frightened animal fights, not scrambling, not wild-eyed. He came out in a low, controlled fury, every muscle in his body coiled, like something that had not yet decided what it was going to do, but had already decided it wasn't going to be nothing. His ears were flat, his lips were pulled back, a scar ran across the bridge of his muzzle, pale against the dark mask of his face, and one of his ears had a notch in the cartilage, where a piece of shrapnel had once passed too close. The auctioneer took a small step backward. He covered it by adjusting his microphone. Half the room leaned away from the platform. The man with the tablet didn't look up. "Starting bid on lot 9 is set at $800, the auctioneer said. Silence. Vex planted his feet on the platform and stood absolutely still, the 2 catch poles forming a loose triangle of tension around his neck and shoulder. He was looking at the room, not at the lights, not at the ceiling, not at nothing. He was looking at the room the way her father used to look at a room, like he was reading every person in it for things they hadn't said yet. 800. Do I have 800? The man with the tablet typed something. 800. 800 to the gentleman in front. Do I have 9? No one moved. 800 once. 800,000. The voice came from the back wall. Tessa didn't realize it was hers until the auctioneer looked up and the entire room turned around. She had not planned to open with 1,000. She had planned to open with 850. But something about the silence, something about the way no one had wanted to touch him, had changed the math in her head. A man 3 rows ahead of her turned all the way around in his chair. He was heavy-set, wearing a Pelican Security Solutions polo shirt, and he looked at Tessa the way people look at something that has wandered into the wrong place. 1,000, the auctioneer confirmed, with an inflection she couldn't read. 1,100, said the tablet man. 12, Tessa said. 13, 14. The Pelican security man turned back to face the front. He had a paddle now, 1,500. Tessa pressed her back against the wall and breathed. $1,800 in the envelope, the paddle man at 1,500. She had $300 left to move. 16, she said. The Pelican man raised his paddle. 17. 1,800. Her ceiling. The absolute last dollar she had pulled together from 7 months of overtime at the fish processing plant in Dartmouth, and a cash loan from her mother that her mother could not afford to give. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. 1,800, Tessa said. The Pelican man raised his paddle again immediately. 2,000. The auctioneer looked at Tessa. She shook her head once, small, precise. She was done. The auctioneer nodded and opened his mouth. And then Vex, who had been standing perfectly still on the platform for 4 minutes while men traded numbers in the air around him. Vex raised his head. His nose came up. His ears shifted forward very slightly, rotating like satellite dishes finding a signal. He turned his head toward the back of the room, toward the wall where Tessa was standing. The auctioneer stopped mid-syllable. Nobody in the room moved. Even the tablet man looked up. Tessa didn't plan what she did next. She had thought about this moment for 3 months, had imagined it going a dozen different ways, had talked herself out of it and back into it so many times that the idea of it had worn smooth in her mind. But standing in that warehouse in Truro with $1,800 that wasn't enough, and a dog on a platform looking at her like a question she didn't know how to answer, she said, "Vex Sieden," the German word, her father's word, the word Eldon Marlowe had used every time he finished a patrol and wanted Vex to stand down. The word Tessa had heard on a voice memo her father had accidentally sent her 3 years ago, laughing and embarrassed, saying, "Ignore that, I was talking to the dog." The two handlers holding the catchpoles looked at each other. Vex sat down, not reluctantly, not on a delay. He sat the way he had been trained to sit, clean, immediate, hind quarters hitting the platform before the echo of the word had finished crossing the room. His ears came up, the rigid tension in his shoulders released, degree by degree like a fist unclenching. He looked at Tessa with an expression that had no clinical name and required none. The auctioneer said nothing for 4 full seconds. The Pelican security man lowered his paddle. The silence broke in pieces, not all at once. Someone coughed. A chair scraped. The hold music, which had been running the entire time without anyone noticing, chose that moment to cycle through to something that might have been a jazz standard, quiet and incongruous, and that small absurdity knocked the room back into ordinary time. The auctioneer looked at the Pelican man. The Pelican man was staring at the platform, where Vex was still sitting in perfect position, eyes on the back wall, ears forward. "Do you want to maintain at 2,000? The auctioneer asked. The Pelican man was quiet for a moment. Then he set the paddle down on his knee. No. It was the quietest word Tessa had ever heard. "Last bid was 1,800, the auctioneer said. He looked at his clipboard, then at the room, then at the back wall. His voice had lost some of its professional neutrality. Not all of it, just some. Going once at 1,800. Going twice. He didn't wait as long as he had on the other lots. Sold. The paperwork took 40 minutes. A woman named Constable Yvette Lafleur from the Military Police Liaison Office processed Tessa's transfer documents at a folding table in a side room that smelled like printer toner and coffee that had been sitting too long. Constable Lafleur had dark eyes and a very controlled expression, and she asked Tessa twice to confirm her relationship to Master Corporal Eldon Marlowe before she would countersign the ownership transfer. "He was my father," Tessa said both times. Constable Lafleur looked at her for a moment after the second time, with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite professionalism, and was something complicated in between. She signed the form. The envelope with the cash went to the disbursements officer. He counted it out twice. The handlers brought Vex into the side room on the catchpoles, which was unnecessary. Tessa understood that from the way they moved, slightly apologetic, slightly uncertain, but procedures were procedures, and nobody in this building had written a procedure for what had just happened in the main hall. She crouched down in the corner of the room, her father's jacket pooling around her knees on the concrete floor, and she held out her hand, palm up. Vex stood at the end of the catchpoles and looked at her. The taller handler said, carefully, "He may not." Vex walked forward. He put his nose to her palm, then her wrist, then the collar of the jacket. He exhaled once through his nose, a long, slow breath, and then he pressed the top of his head against her collarbone and stood there, still as stone. One of the handlers made a sound that was not a word. Tessa wrapped both arms around Vex's neck and closed her eyes, and didn't care that she was on a concrete floor in a room that smelled like burnt coffee, or that she still had 400 kilometers of driving ahead of her, or that she was going to have to explain to her mother why there was now a 70-pound former special operations dog sleeping in the spare room. She just stayed there for a while. The drive back to Cape Breton took 4.5 hours. Vex rode in the back seat of her 2009 Civic, which was not designed for this, with his chin on the center console the entire time. He watched the highway through the windshield in the same alert, steady way he'd done everything else. Not anxious, not restless, just watching. Processing. Nova Scotia in late October scrolled past the windows in shades of wet spruce and granite grey, and the heater made a sound like distant arguing, and somewhere around Antigonish the rain started, and Tessa turned the wipers on and Vex's ears tracked the sound for a moment before he decided it was not a threat. She talked to him. She hadn't planned to, but she did. She talked about her father, about the way Eldon Marlowe used to call her on Sunday mornings, because that was the only time the signal was reliable, at whatever forward position he was sitting in, and how he always asked about the weather in Cape Breton first, before anything else, like he needed to place her in geography before he could hear her voice properly. She talked about the voice memo. She talked about what her father had told her once, on the phone, 2 years before he died, that Vex was the best partner he'd ever had in the field, and that he would bet his career on that dog making the right call in a dark building, and that the thing people didn't understand about working dogs was that they weren't obedient. Obedient was too small a word. Obedient meant you followed instructions. What Vex did was something closer to trust. He decides to work with me every single day, her father had said. He could stop any time. He doesn't stop. Tessa kept her eyes on the road and her voice as steady as she could manage. Vex's chin stayed on the console the whole way home. Her mother, Gail Marlowe, was standing in the porch light when the Civic pulled into the driveway on Baddeck Road. Gail was 56 years old. She had her son's eyes and her late husband's stubbornness, and she had said approximately 47 times in the past 6 months that she thought this plan was impractical, inadvisable, and possibly dangerous. She had also, without being asked, cleared out the spare room, put a water dish on the kitchen floor, and bought a 40-pound bag of premium grain-free dog food from the farm supply store in town. She stood in the porch light and watched Tessa open the back door of the Civic. Vex stepped out onto the gravel driveway and sat. Gail Marlowe looked at him for a long time. Her arms were crossed over her chest the way they always were when she was trying not to let her face do something she hadn't decided it was allowed to do yet. Vex looked back at her. He had his ears forward. His tail moved once low and slow, like a flag in light wind. Gail made a small sound, almost inaudible, and unfolded her arms. She walked down the porch steps and crouched in front of Vex, the same way Tessa had done in the side room of the Ware house, and she held out her hand, and Vex pressed his nose into her palm, and Gail Marlowe, who had not cried at the notification, not at the funeral, not at the folded flag, not once in public in 14 months, pressed her forehead to the top of Vex's head and cried. Tessa stood beside the car and let it happen. After a while, Gail said, without lifting her head, "He needs a bath. I know. He smells like a kennel. He was in one." Gail straightened up. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, the same efficient gesture Tessa had seen her father use 1,000 times. She looked at Vex, who was looking up at her with that steady, weighing attention he seemed to give to everything. "Come inside, then," Gail said. She said it to both of them. There were people after. A retired sergeant named Burwell from the Pictou County Legion who called Tessa 3 days later because someone at the auction had mentioned what happened and it had gotten around, the way things get around in military communities, faster than any news cycle. He said he'd been trying to get media attention on the MWD retirement policy for 2 years and asked if she'd be willing to talk. She talked. A journalist at the Halifax Chronicle did a piece in November. It ran on a Thursday, and by Monday it had been shared 11,000 times, mostly by veterans' families, mostly in provinces Tessa had never been to. The comments section was a place she refused to go, but her mother read her the ones she thought were worth hearing. One was from a woman in Winnipeg who had lost her husband in Afghanistan, and whose husband's K9 partner had been euthanized without notification 2 weeks after his death. She wrote that she had not known another family had been trying to get the dog. She wrote that she had not known she could have asked. Tessa called her. They talked for 3 hours. By spring, there were 11 families. They didn't have a formal name for themselves. Tessa called them privately, the 11, because it was winter in Cape Breton, and she wasn't feeling poetic about it. They drafted a letter to the Department of National Defense. Major Drummond, who had in fact been the one to keep writing hold on Vex's file, came out of retirement long enough to sign it and say some things on record that she hadn't been permitted to say while she was still serving. The letter asked for one thing, a right of first refusal, that before any MWD was processed through the disposal system, the family of the last handler would be notified and given a defined window to claim the dog. It wasn't complicated. It didn't require a new budget line or a new department. It required a form and a change to an internal policy that someone should have thought to change 15 years ago. The Department of National Defense took 8 months to respond. They said yes. Tessa was at her kitchen table when she got the email. It was 6:30 in the morning, and the coffee was still brewing, and she was still wearing the old canvas jacket she'd taken to sleeping in since September, because it was warm and because it smelled increasingly less like her father, and she wanted to slow that down as long as possible. Vex was lying under the table with his chin on her foot. He'd been doing that since the 3rd night. She'd asked the veterinary behaviorist, a quiet and precise woman named Dr. Okafor, who drove out from Sydney every 2 weeks, whether it was a behavior she should discourage. Dr. Okafor had said she didn't see the clinical rationale for discouraging it. She'd also said that in her experience, the dogs that came out of high-intensity operational environments and found their way to a calm and consistent home generally did one of 2 things. They shut down, or they quietly reorganized their sense of purpose around the new household. Vex, she said, was doing the second thing. He'd started eating reliably again in the 2nd week. By the 3rd week, he was patrolling the perimeter of the property in the mornings, methodical and unhurried, completing the circuit before he came inside. He'd started sleeping through the night. He was, by all available evidence, a dog who had decided where he was. Tessa read the email twice. Then she sat back and looked out the kitchen window at the early light coming across the field, thin and horizontal, the way Cape Breton light gets in spring when it's still fighting with the cold. And she thought about her father, and about a voice memo sent by accident, and about a word in German that means stand down. She thought about a room full of men with paddles and tablets and Bluetooth earpieces, and a dog on a platform that had belonged to none of them. Vex pressed his chin more firmly against the top of her foot. "Okay," she said, to no one in particular, or to both of them. She got up and poured the coffee, and the light came further across the field, and the old farmhouse on Baddeck Road went about the business of mourning, and the dog who had once cleared buildings in the dark, and stood in the noise and heat of things no one should have to stand in, was exactly where he was supposed to be, under a kitchen table in Cape Breton, keeping watch over the daughter of the man he had trusted, unhurried now and finally still.